Hi, and welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Maria Schepis. And we are going to start on chapter 44, The Black Magician. Our protagonist, of course, has just witnessed again his student terribly go down the left-handed path. We'll see how that all comes full circle in the next chapter, which we'll try to sneak in today as well. And so, thinking about black magic in the darkness, and we see it all around us today, even as it is. Earlier in this series, before one of the chapters, I sang a prayer that had been given by Saint Germain as Ascended Master to Mark and Elizabeth Prophet, called I Am the Light of the Heart. And in the previous episode, I sang a little snippet of the song Atlantis by Donovan, which I'm hoping to get better at and do more of as we move on to A Dweller on Two Planets, once we have completed the Red Lion. And just thinking about the black magic and the black magicians, I think I want to give that prayer, but we can do it to Donovan's chords for Atlantis. I am the light of the heart, shining in the darkness of being, and changing all into the golden treasure of the mind of Christ. I am projecting my love out into the world, to erase all errors and to break down all barriers. I am the power of infinite love, amplifying itself until it is victorious, world without end. And there we'll find our new Atlantis. Worlds without end. Let's get there. Okay. Chapter 44, The Black Magician. In 1805, the Trinosophist Freemasonic fraternity formed a chapter in Paris, quote unquote, for those who investigate the three sciences. Ragon invited me to come to the opening, and I stayed in his house. It was here I encountered Ernst Müller again. I was just getting out of my coach when I saw him coming up the street. He was tattered and disheveled, obviously reduced to beggary. When he saw me, his eyes dilated with shock, and he ran away. Soon after this, I went home to say goodbye to my parents, who were going to spend some time in the Orient. I had some things to finish at Grotte before I could join them, but I accompanied them as far as the border. By now, we were so united in spirit that their bodily absence did not sadden me. I knew of a certainty I would not lose them. The years that followed at Castle were busy and peaceful. Amadeus gradually became a diligent partner in my work and climbed rapidly in the order. In 1818, Ragon presented a series of lectures on ancient and modern initiations at the Paris Lodge, and, since I had business for the order in Paris, I was glad to have the opportunity to hear my illustrious friend's lectures. My main reason for going, though, was to acquaint him with Victor Amadeus. During this trip, I got more news of Ernst Müller. The female relatives of one of my colleagues were chattering enthusiastically about a wonderful man who had healed Madame X and Mademoiselle Y simply by putting his hands on them and breathing upon them. The two women had long-standing and singular illnesses. Madame X had been a widow for 20 years, though she was still quite young. This very religious woman suffered from agonizing headaches that forced her to stay in a darkened room and scream with pain. The malady had grown steadily worse and was completely engulfing her life. She confided to my informant that these attacks were always preceded by shameful dreams she could not bear to describe. Mademoiselle Y's case was similar. She was a woman no longer young who had vowed never to marry when her fiancé died, and she had held to her oath despite the proposals of many men captivated by her wealth and beauty. Her problem was shortness of breath, difficulty in swallowing, and vertigo. The problem had become so intense that she scarcely dared leave the house. It became even worse when she was in company. If someone stared at her or she heard a deep male voice, she would choke immediately. Both women had been completely healed by this gentleman after only a few treatments, and now they were his devoted followers. He had gained a large number of adherents by similar phenomenal results. His name, they said, was José Maria de Chassin. When we were alone, I asked my colleague what he thought of the man with the high-sounding name. "I don't know," he replied thoughtfully. "There is something peculiar about him. For one thing, all his patients are women. As for what he's like, he is a muscular, handsome fellow of about 30 who grooms himself like a dandy. He's intelligent enough and highly educated, and he must be wealthy because he has a huge palace and a vast establishment of servants and carriages. His palace is peculiar too. It's all hidden lights, heavy draperies, exotic statues, and hidden music. Luxurious lounges alternate with glass cases full of snakes. The whole thing produces an astounding hypnotic effect. Nobody seems to know where he got his money. But maybe it's obvious. He treats only women who are very rich, past their prime, and suffering from nervous disorders. His treatments are suspicious too. The treatment room is draped in deep red with the matching furniture. In the center is a pedestal containing a soft chaise longue. The patients, the ones who talk, all describe the treatment the same way. They remove their clothing and put on a long red gown to cover their nakedness. Then they lie down on the sofa, facing their own image in a mirror suspended from the ceiling. The room is slowly filled with a smell of sweet incense, and the light burns down to a dull red. Soft, delicate music is heard from behind the draperies, and they are soothed to a pleasant drowsiness. Then the marvelous man appears, a red silk gown billowing about his muscular figure. He leans over them, and his warm breath touches their eyes. Then he lays his hands upon them, and they lose consciousness with a shudder that spreads the concentrated healing force. Mademoiselle Y says that before going to sleep, she feels as if nectar and ambrosia had been poured into her veins. And Madame X confessed still more to an indiscreet friend. She said, "You wake up with a pleasurable weariness, victorious and sated upon a bed of laurels. All tension is dissolved and every longing is satisfied. Even your skin breathes and the blood feels youthful in the veins. You are full of hope and the joy of life. The weariness is followed by a fine appetite." This description was a disturbing silhouette of my fallen student. My suspicions were verified when Ragon and I paid an unexpected visit to Madame X's salon. There he sat like a pasha, surrounded by aging, lonely women who basked in the flame of his sensuality. The path he had traveled was written in his face. His eyes were hooded and his lower lip was divided by a fawn line repeated and reaffirmed in that aggressive jaw. He had had his hair arranged artistically in a mass of shining black curls. The blind sculptor of passion had certainly done a marvelous job on him. In just a few years it had formed from his willing raw material a demon of sexual rage. The moment he saw me, the bumptious confidence vanished. He made his excuses quickly and left, fearing I would question him. At that point, I didn't have a single question to ask him. I knew I couldn't disillusion his followers. He had bound them to himself with the cords of tremendous lust. The victims themselves could have loosed this bond by freeing their spirits, but their spirits yet slept in the glowing crucibles of their bodies. Any attempt I could make would be futile. My words would be washed away by the pulsing of their veins as the skilled sorcerer put their moral senses to sleep and freed them to act their lust. Some time later, Ragon wrote to me about the scandals that were ending Chassain's career in Paris. The police had had a series of complaints from the families of his followers, and their investigation brought several studies to light. For example, they discovered the real secret of Mademoiselle Y's early death. She had suddenly realized after several months of treatments that she was pregnant. A high-born lady had thrown away her life because Chassain had no use for her after he had taken her fortune. It turned out that Chassain's unfortunate clients had almost without exception spent themselves into ruin because of him. Deprived of their free will, they had signed promissory notes that made them beggars. The man was an insatiable Moloch. Nobody could imagine what he had wanted with all that money. It was more than he could possibly spend on the most luxurious life. When the truth came out, several other clients of the Red Room destroyed themselves rather than face the scandal. Chassain was arrested and sentenced to death after a lurid trial. He still had some influence left, however, for the sentence was changed to life in the galleys. I wish I could believe that was the end of the episode and that Ernst Müller had disappeared from my life. Certainly the few miserable years he would spend in the galleys would curb his appetites. Their horror would serve as a danger signal in his subconscious, a barricade at one of the beaten paths to hell. But I kept thinking about him. Gradually I became aware of a certainty that the thread that bound us had not been severed. He would come back, regardless of how much it cost him. So I waited for the return of Ernst Müller. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45, The Circle Completed. And that is the last chapter of the book. There will be a postscript, which I don't think we'll cover in this reading, but this is the last regular chapter of the book. The Circle Completed. He came back to Grotte in 1830. Nobody recognized him, but I knew immediately who was the horrible human wreck who begged for lodging. In truth, there was little enough left of the Ernst Müller we had known. The fine voice was a rasp, and he had lost 3 fingers. Scars showed through his thinning hair, and his eyes were rheumy and uncertain. He was stooped and bent and showed obvious signs of syphilis. When he saw I recognized him, he began to tremble and would have fainted had I not helped him to a chair. "Forgive me," he croaked. "I've waited so long to see you. I've tried to get here for years. It's the one goal that has kept me alive. It would have been so much easier to die." He was gasping for breath, and I urged him to lie down, but he would not. The impatience of the soul on its deathbed to finish some uncompleted business drove him on. No, I've got to talk now. You must understand me now, or we will be too late, much too late. I'll be stronger in a minute. It's just the excitement. Could you get me a drink? I'm not a drunkard, that's one thing I never stooped to, but it doesn't really matter anymore what I haven't done. I mixed him a mildly alcoholic, fortifying drink, and he drank in great gasps. Then he closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair. Abruptly, he began to speak in a low, even voice, speaking of the events of his life as though they had happened to some stranger. He began with Isabelle de Blancourt-Wells and his discovery of black magic, describing his experiments that had met with such frightening, intoxicating success. The events he described are much as I had reconstructed them, but I had been wrong about his feelings toward Isabelle. Nor had I known that he had already experimented with a well-known socialite before Isabelle entered the picture. That affair had ended quietly. I broke out in a sweat when Isabel responded to my command, he told me. I was jubilant but frightened. She was wearing only a sable coat to cover her nakedness, and beneath it was pure fire and fragrance, a living flame. I learned later that any virtuous woman becomes an insatiable hetera once she's freed of her mortal scruples. I didn't induce the passion that made them crave more sophisticated sensual pleasures. It was their own passion to which they surrendered. Isabel's suicide had forced him into a crisis. I didn't mean to kill her. I really and truly loved her. She was the kind of woman I could respect and admire. She captivated me completely, a perfect lady and a perfect lover. She was brilliant, a true partner in lovemaking, a beauty of inexhaustible variety. No other women can be as beautiful as gray-eyed ash blondes. The delicate nuances of her skin and lips, those daring, firm breasts, the refined yet sensual movements of that slender body. She was the jewel I coveted most of all. I knew I was the only one who could satisfy her passion, her natural master and mate, and I was sure she knew it too, for all she tried to deny it. She soon became so inflamed with passion that she would hurry to my bed, humble in her hunger, without my even commanding her. I thought that surely then she would admit she loved me. I knew she was pregnant. I meant to elope with her and marry her honorably, but she slipped away from me, and just a few moments before she had clung to me like an obsessed animal. I hadn't called her. She just came into my room in broad daylight and threw herself upon me. Then she took the poison. All of a sudden, the whole world collapsed. I was deathly afraid, remembering your warning. For the first time, I realized I had committed a sin, a dreadful transcendental crime with horrible consequences. I remembered how I had promised to stay on the straight path and had even been arrogant enough to ask if you would contact me when you realized you were mistaken. I was horribly ashamed and wanted more than anything to return to the path. Isabel's death and its attendant scandal made it impossible for me to stay in Brussels, so I went to Paris, determined to make an honest living and never use black magic again. But I soon used up my savings, and those dark powers had blocked every possibility of employment. I was soon homeless and starving, spending my nights in doorways or the shrubs of the Bois de Boulogne and eating garbage from the streets. No one would trust me to do the simplest of jobs. There was something about me that made them suspicious. It was apparent they didn't know how to place me. Everyone felt I belonged to a higher social stratum and had fallen to this estate through crime. I became embittered at living in filth and starvation. I realized it was no good struggling. I couldn't rise honestly from the depths to which I had sunk. No one cared that I was trying to go straight, yet I obstinately hung on. Finally, I became dizzy with hunger. Then I remembered Ragon. I had known he was in Paris, but I had avoided his neighborhood. I decided to visit him, confess my error, and ask for help. I was sure he would help me. Then I saw you standing by his gate. I can't explain exactly how I felt. All my bitterness and sense of futility rose to the surface, and I found myself blaming you for everything. I was ashamed and afraid when I saw you, but this soon gave way to hatred. You were the one who had let me taste the fruit of the tree of knowledge and then sent me out into the world half prepared. If I had stayed at Grotte, I would never have gotten into this situation. You had known I would fall and had cynically exposed me to temptations I couldn't resist. Now I was an outcast from both heaven and hell, and I saw you turn away indifferently. You see, a man has to belong somewhere with his whole heart and soul. Those weak creatures who try to straddle the road without choosing a direction are always outcast. Woe to the lukewarm and hesitant. The people who really count in life ride one road or the other openly and proudly. Whether they are the deepest villains or the greatest saints, they drink the cup of their lives to the full and accept the consequences. Now, I had one road barred to me. The other was clear, but I was scared to go down it. Suddenly I asked myself why I should humiliate myself by a life of beggary when I could make all the secret lewdness of the city open before me. I merely had to want to. By this time I had reached the Bois de Boulogne, where I saw an aging but still beautiful lady sitting on a bench fanning herself languidly. Her carriage waited respectfully in the distance, and her jewels and clothing were clear signs of great wealth. When I first glanced at her, she met my gaze and looked away in unutterable boredom. That glance was like a whiplash across my senses, and I swore in all the bitterness of my soul that I would change that bored look, hers, and that of other women like her. Thus I burned my bridges and consciously, willingly stepped back upon the road of black magic. You know at least part of the results. Like a child who believes it can cheat the death that takes its elders, I thought I could escape the consequences of my deeds. I did some facile reasoning on the subject and blocked every approach by which I thought myself vulnerable. I knew, of course, that if one dealt in the venom of emotions, he himself had to be immune from them. I never permitted myself to feel either love or pity. Though I descended into the most sophisticated sexual inferno, it was always for my own pleasure, never anybody else's. I had no scruples and no emotional attachments. I exploited every opportunity to the full and enjoyed the riches of life behind an impenetrable fortress of selfishness. For a few years, I lulled myself into an illusion of safety. Then one day I realized that despite my efforts to conserve it, my sexual energy was diminishing. I was being consumed by the very fire I used to lure my victims. So I decided to retire with the fortune I had acquired and regenerate my energies by a period of total abstinence. I didn't realize that I couldn't quit. I needed rest and quiet, but wherever I went, my dreadful profession followed me. Women crept into my bed at night, aflame with lust. I tried to chase them away and lock my door, but they knew well enough how to rouse the passion of my sick imagination. Time and again they drained the strength I was trying to conserve. I was bound by the spell I had conjured up. It lured a hungry swarm of women to me everywhere. In desperation, I went back to Paris, not realizing I was putting my head into a noose. My past practice had begun to come to light while I was away, and the whole thing blew up in my face before I was even aware of it. About the same time, I realized some nocturnal succubus had given me syphilis. My whole world collapsed, and I didn't much care. The court sentenced me to death, but one of my patients, a kind and influential lady, got the sentence reduced to life in the galleys. The inhuman life on the galleys broke me physically within a few months. I crouched on the bench I was chained to, unable to lift an oar despite the cruelest lashing. The sound of my tortured breathing filled my ears, and I waited for death. Then I had an inexpressibly horrible experience that drove me back into the land of the living. I seemed to be looking into a chasm swarming with slimy reptiles. No human mind could understand the dreadful transcendental monsters that were waiting for me on the other side, their eager demoniac eyes gleaming with a promise of torments far more terrifying than any torture. I clung to my body like a drowning man. I had to save this decaying clay that kept me in the physical world. Desperately, I struggled to stay alive with superhuman will. I had to stay alive. What I faced was something worse than hell itself. The destruction of my personality smashed into little pieces of animal existence. If I could just stay in Ernst Müller's body, I could work to attain a higher plane and reach a path where I can return as a penitent human being. And so, I'm still alive despite every law of nature. They maimed me twice for trying to escape. They beat me till I was half dead, and once they staked me out in the blazing sun. But here I sit. I've finally reached my goal. You know why I came. It was the memory of my life with you that sustained me through every hell. The very fact that I've made it here proves that I deserve the chance I'm asking. I've already won the right. Restore my health. Give me just a few decades to climb from the abyss, to regain my right to a conscious personality. I don't care to live any longer than that. I don't want eternity, just one human lifespan. Now, sheer fatigue silenced him. His face was covered with perspiration. What compassion he roused in me, yet I was helpless. How could I deny the frantic request of a dying man, even when it was based on gross error? I could not argue with a man in that condition or crush him with a blunt refusal. I decided I would examine him, treat him with any means I could, and strengthen him as much as possible. Maybe I could give him a few years at last. But my hopes were crushed by the examination. There wasn't a sound organ in his body, and the syphilis in his bloodstream had gone beyond control. His body was just a decomposing hulk held up by willpower, a corpse containing a damned soul. Already his decaying form gave off the stench of corruption. Ernst sensed the truth when he saw my distress. That doesn't matter. He waved this away. I am alive by a miracle of willpower, and you can work a yet greater miracle. Don't waste my time with your scholarly game of natural explanations. I don't have any time. Give me the elixir. Nothing else can save me. You can't let me debased into an animal existence while I cling to your hand and beg with my whole soul. He grasped my arm with one mutilated hand, revealing a ghastly, feverish strength. What makes you think I can give you a thing like that? I asked helplessly. He shoved my arm away and pointed with cold rage. Look in the mirror! Automatically I turned and looked into the mirror over the wash bowl. Now I know perfectly well you're nearly 70 years old. Can you think of some natural reason why you don't look older than 30? What could I tell him? I couldn't tell him the method I had used to preserve my physical condition. He wasn't ready for it. And the medication itself I had adapted to only gradually and had prepared it to suit my own constitution. It would kill a weaker person, especially one as ill as he was, but I had to tell him something. I have stayed young-looking, I admitted cautiously. It's the result of occult exercises and a certain essence. But unless you have decades of conditioning exercises behind you and have learned other things, things that cannot be revealed to the uninitiated, the essence will corrode the life energies like a powerful poison. If I gave it to you, I'd be committing murder. He was deaf to what I said, seizing only on my admission the fluid existed. He would take responsibility for the possible adverse side effects himself. I know it won't destroy me. Surely you can see that I have superhuman willpower, and I have done plenty of occult exercises. Even if the direction was wrong, I gained from them. When I denied his request, he threw himself at my feet, begging, promising, and cursing until he exhausted his frail strength and fainted. I put him to bed and injected some strengthening essences. When he began to come to, I left him. It was an ominous and nebulous mass of problems I carried to the study that night. Despite the hour, I couldn't go to bed. I had to decipher the hieroglyph that kept confronting me. Now it was so urgent I couldn't avoid it. 3 rooms from me lay a man in agony, a man who in his extremity depended on me for salvation. He wouldn't listen to the truth. All he heard was the tale of magic within him. He wanted the elixir, but I had none for him. Now he was resting, gathering his strength to extort a few more hours from death and win from me what he wanted. Since I could find no answer myself, I consulted the stars, mapping astrological calculations by the peaceful lamplight. I could hear the wind sighing in the moonless park outside. Then suddenly I remembered. I had been here before. The same feelings, the same dark silence. In imagination I sat upon a blue box in a dark barn, making calculations in a book on my knee. I was even drawing the same aspects of the planets in the two circles of the zodiac. My destiny and Hans Burgner's. Ernst Miller's? Yes, I now sat in Rochard's place. The house of death, the 8th house, was very crowded in my horoscope tonight. The same dark judges now and then. No, not then, it was all now. Hans Burgner's circle, Ernst Miller's, overlapped my own in terrible conjunctions, making the judges executioners. Mars with Mercury in the sign of Gemini. Saturn in close conjunction. The moon gathered their whole destructive force in her chalice and flung it upon me and upon him who lurked silently, Hans Ernst. Suddenly, I could see through the walls. I saw him shuffling hesitantly along the slate floor of the laboratory, his haggard figure black against the white walls. One maimed hand held a candle while the other searched the shelves, cabinets, and drawers. Impatiently he tore covers off vials and crucibles, spilling powders and liquids. It was lucky for him I had labeled them in the Latin he could read, otherwise he would have poisoned himself. Of course, he couldn't find what he wanted. Now I could feel his sick anger and erratic thoughts. His monomania was taking complete control of him. He had to get the arcanum I hoarded and gain the life I've maliciously denied him. Even if it were sealed by the most holy sacrament, he had to break the seal. And if flesh and blood should try to stop him, well, it would just be one more corpse to put beside the women who had died for him. What did it matter if he got the great arcanum? His body could not stand much more. He had to get it. And what else could he be protecting the great secret but human flesh and blood? The moon rose blood red over the park. Now the problem was laid bare in crystal clarity, and I was tranquil. I left a letter for Victor Amadeus, giving him instructions about the order and where and how to deposit my important papers. There was nothing else to do, for my father and I had long agreed the castle and estate should go to the order. The moonlight drew silver columns on the floor as I lay down peacefully. A slight draught told me the door had opened and closed. The transparent curtain billowed in the window. Then I heard his irregular breathing. I did not move, but listened to the painfully careful steps. I felt a deep compassion for this poor creature with his monomania, approaching to do something he had no intention of doing, something I had done once. Now he stood, motionless by the bed, staring at me intently to detect the rhythm of my breathing. Satisfied, he leaned cautiously over me, feeling under my pillow and searching the nightstand. He opened the nightstand drawer and searched there. Then I felt his hand run over my chest. Suddenly he felt the small flat box I wore on a gold chain, and he stopped, trembling. Just then the moon emerged from a cloud and illuminated my face, showing him that I watched his every move. He stared back at me in terror, like a man who sees a cobra. Stumbling back, his hand encountered the bronze night lamp, and he grasped it without conscious volition and struck me between the eyes. The first blow crushed my brain, so I felt no pain. Ernst kept on beating the crushed shell madly, determined to crush out those 2 points of light and tear his own life from my body. So the circle is completed. The postscript is entitled Opus Magnum. And I think we'll save it. Thank you.